Hello. Hello, thank you for coming, and thank you, INSTAR, the Instituto Hannah Arendt, from Havana and elsewhere, to invite me for this talk. My name is Gabriela Rangel. I prepare something that deals with my own history, because I'm Venezuelan and I live in New York, and Venezuela is only known in the art world for the avant-garde from the 50s, the formalist avant-garde from the 50s, and the impact of that avant-garde from now on. So this is a paper about what happened in the 60s other than that avant-garde, and how it constructed a new political order that was destroyed, but also it was reinvented. So it's about the intersection between art and politics between 1960 and 1973. And I choose 1960, which is the beginning of a democratic elected government of Romulo Betancourt, and 1973 because it was the end of the guerrillas and the beginning of the new left, led by Teodoro Petkov, who was a person who really criticized, the traditional left. And he created a new movement in the arts that was really interesting, and I'm going to talk about that. So the intersection between art and politics might shed the light, might help us to understand the revolutionary break that occurred towards the end of the 20th century in Venezuela, that ended with the petro modernity model of philanthropy and also the model of democracy that we built. The period was never considered by the conceptualismos del sur. As you know, in Latin America, there was a very strong group of historians, critics, who studied, what happened during the Cold War in Latin America. But Venezuela was never included in the repertoire. And Venezuela produced very important dissidents during the time. So over the past decades, the relationship between art and politics in Venezuela has been discussed through architecture and public art and the ideological debates that took place between artists, writers, and critics that marked the origins of geometric abstraction in the 40s, and a tendency in the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s. And but people don't know that between the 60s and 70s, art and politics were a contested field, which produced a short span of interdisciplinary experimental art manifestations that concluded with the political propaganda produced by the artist Jacobo Borges, who transformed the candidate into a saint, Jose Gregorio Hernandez. I'm not going to show any image, sorry, and excuse me for the dryness of this talk, but this is about that relationship. There were many things happening in the 60s. The foundation of first of all, the arrival of Fidel Castro in 1959, the beginning of democracy, the consolidation of the National Peace Agreement, La Pacificación, with the foundation of the Movimiento al Socialismo in 1973, which was the year that there was a coup to Allende at the same time in Latin America. And there were manifestations in the 60s called the homage to necrophilia and the robbery of the Museum of Fine Arts in Caracas, which was characterized by Guy Debord as the perfect model of action, of political action. So the context of the second half of the 60s in Venezuela was defined by the end of the struggles between the radical insurgents and the government, until President Rafael Caldera signed the agreement, the peace agreement known as La Pacificación. The agreement paved the way to a process of rearticulation of radical artists and writers that belonged to El Techo de la Ballena and El Círculo de Pez Dorado, with younger photographers and filmmakers, for the celebration of the 400 years of Caracas, the Cuatricentenario, which occurred in 1968. I think I'm gonna, this is too formal, maybe I'm gonna improvise a little bit, but I wanna talk about the birth of the petro state, of the state that produced a model of philanthropy and monumental, real estate for the arts. Um, the majority of Venezuelan historians agree that oil exploitation brought a new social political identity to the nation, triggering an impulse of modernization as well as consolidating what they have identified as modernity, a process of secularization, as we know, specialization and technocratization. But this process took place in Venezuela in the 40s when an elected president was deposed by a military junta. And the military junta paved the way for this model in the 50s, from 48 to 59, when Perez Jimenez was deposed as well. So by the end of the 30s, Venezuela was producing oil extensively, as we know, and a fast process of modernization, of urbanization took place, an emergence of a professional middle class. As a result of these changes, the 20th century, notoriously about the patrician Arturo Uslar Pietri writer, diagnosed the malaise of the oil well vis-a-vis the mutation of the rural nation into an oil state. This oil state also produced many interesting moments, including merging of the president, the elected president, Romulo Gallegos, in 1948, organized a festival of folklore to which many Cuban left writers attended, and it was a model for popular culture that the state embraced. That model also opened an open space called Taller Libre de Arte, in which the artists run the space in order to create a hub for discussion, for distribution, and also for information. This was a short span moment that ended with the dictatorship in 52, but that space was concomitant to also the construction of the Universidad Central de Venezuela, which was a project that the petro state embraced. The Universidad Central de Venezuela was built in it's a very old project that Carlos Raúl Villanueva, who was an architect who studied in Paris, when he came back to Venezuela, he proposed to build a campus, a very long and big campus of the university, in which they will merge art and architecture, the integration of the arts. Carlos Raúl Villanueva couldn't build that project until the dictatorship took over, the control of the state. And then they provided the funds and the resources for build this university. The university was a very interesting space because it merged the European avant-garde with the local avant-garde that was been developing over the years, over between 48 and 50, and particularly El Grupo Los Disidentes, the dissidents, and also some artists who were not part of the group that were, doing some sort of modern vernacular art, and combine, architecture with this, avant-garde of artists. Villanueva started the draft in the 40s, and as I said, he finished in 1960s. The Ciudad Universitaria took 20 years to complete, and more importantly, they created the template for future investments in public cultural commissions. It is not accidental that Villanueva's utopian plan for Caracas was placed on the university. Utopias usually advance an extreme layout of the city, one designed to promote and the presumed rational character of a social body that inhabits it. In many utopian cities, the layout itself is conceived as a learning machine to be activated by men and women in order not to be happy, but first to learn how to be happy, a necessary precondition of the ideal social organization. The Ciudad Universitaria was a learning machine for Venezuela, and this is one of the first signs of this petrostate. The second one is the invasion of modernism, as it was called by Miguel Arroyo. Miguel Arroyo is a very interesting person. He was the first professional director of the Museum of Modern Art in Caracas, of the Museum of Fine Arts in Caracas, and he was also an artist and a designer. I would like to recover this assessment that Miguel Arroyo said. He said, from the perspective of the plastic arts, the decade of the 60s represents the consolidation of modernism in Venezuela, the birth or the embracement of unforeseen tendencies in the field of painting, sculpture, drawing, and graphic arts. By modernism, I'm referring to this particular case to the abandonment of the idea of art as mimesis and its replacement for a notion so distant of imitation of nature that, according to the artists of the period, proposes the creation of a parallel universe. Nonetheless, this consolidation was not easy to achieve. In the previous decade, the invasions of abstraction and other forms of modern expression, to name them in a particular way, were battled with opinions that were artistic, social, and nationalistic, as well as political. In general, one can assert that the majority of people resisted to considering art those productions coming out of modernism, either because all what they saw or learned responded to the idea of imitation, or because they considered painting and sculpture as instruments of social and political critique, or because their search in the arts was directed to find sort of relationship with some glorified form of indigenous past, or to find the expression of both the national and the American identity. All these issues were not simply offered by modernism, but just implicitly negated through its productions. This is what Miguel Arroyo thinks about the 60s. Arroyo's summary acknowledged the invasions of modern art and its modernism, abstract or figurative, including that such ideas were solidified in the period. More significantly, he suggested that dialectic companion in the 50s, the geometric abstraction avant-garde group Los Disidentes undertook an abrasive aesthetic war from Paris, and some Marxist and socially oriented intellectuals and artists realigned themselves in preparation for resisting and eventually bring to an end to the Pérez Jiménez dictatorship from 1950 from 1958, as I said again. Significantly, both ideological tendencies were represented through works integrated in the Ciudad Universitaria. The 1950s, the weak and provincial local art field began a second moment of the modernization, not only through Villanueva's project, but discursively, the polemics and magazines dedicated to art, literature, and of course, politics. Arroyo's appraise of modernism and the sphere of detractors was not limited to Las Disidentes or Villanueva's tropical appropriation of Le Corbusier, but it was nuanced to emphasize the central issues concomitant to modernism, the anti-modern tendency and the collective elaboration of a public discourse for the arts. There is a general assumption that the debates about painting and sculpture, which took place in the 50s and the 60s, were not useful and even destructive. I do not share this opinion because, among other things, I remember how painful it was to find out when I was a student that our patrons from the 19th to the beginning of the 20th century have not publicly exteriorized their thoughts and feelings about painting. These are things that Miguel Arroyo think about that moment in which art is divided between figurative and geometric abstraction, which was a construction created by the materialization of the Ciudad Universitaria, and that was not, active during the 40s. The third feature that I want to mention from this, template of modernism and public art investments is necrophilia. You will say, wow, necrophilia, that's very strong. But necrophilia was a concept created by El Techo de la Ballena, which was a neo-Dada group that was founded in 1960 by a group of people from the left who were very much fascinated by the Cuban Revolution. As many of you don't know, Fidel Castro arrived to Caracas in 1959 to find the help of the Venezuelan government, the newly appointed government, to build the revolution in Cuba. But the government the government of Romulo Betancourt was a government of a Trotskyist revisionism. So he was not interested in helping Fidel, and the opposite. He was interested in destroying Fidel. So Fidel Castro found that he didn't find any help, but then he went to the university in 1958 to give a talk among the students. The students were fascinated, and among them were, the members of El Techo de la Ballena, who decided to become a neo-Dada guerrilla aligned with Cuba. Fidel left, and then El Techo de la Ballena started their opposition to the establishment by attacking geometric abstraction. The first event that they organized was called Homenaje a la Cursilería, Homage to Schmaltz. Homage to Schmaltz was very similar to what Tanya and her collaborators are doing here in Documenta. It's a living display in which they have documents and they have artistic gestures in which they show how ridiculous people became when they officialized the avant-garde into a museum. Ergo, geometric abstraction. They were making fun of geometric abstraction, and they were making fun also of people who were doing works that seemed to be in tandem with the desire to be international and universal. This was the first thing that El Techo de la Ballena did. Then afterwards, they did something a little bit stronger, and that is the homage to necrophilia, homenaje a la necrophilia. The homage to necrophilia consisted on finding corpses of cows and many other animals and put the decomposed meat in display with paintings that allude to the political struggles that were having factions of insurrection in Venezuela. There were two main insurrections in 1962. There was the Porteñazo and the Carupanazo. And what El Techo de la Ballena did was to create this metaphor of decomposition and struggle in order to talk about the opposition between the left and the government. The government suspended the constitutional rights. There was a military, curfew. And the government, well, first of all, Romulo Betancourt as a president was attacked there was a bomb attack to him, and he was injured. This was not related to these insurgents or leftists. This was the dictator Trujillo. Trujillo tried to kill Romulo Betancourt, but it created a lot of agitation in the population. Then there were two military insurrections that took place in two cities that were crucial for the distribution of oil. And then El Techo de la Ballena took these, events, these occurrences, as part of their, poetics of, guerrilla, neo-Dada guerrilla. This was in 1962. The homage to necrophilia was closed by the sanitary authorities because it was considered unhealthy for the people to see the carcasses of the cows decomposing. And of course, Del Techo de la Ballena saw it as a censorship, as a moment of censorship. Then there is a third event, very important, that is very related to this one, which was the Museum of Fine Arts in Caracas, whose director is Miguel Arroyo, the same person who talked about the invasions of modernism that I just read. He inaugurated a very important exhibition that came from France, that it was called Modernist Art from France, and it was an exhibition that traveled in Latin America. It included 50 pieces that probably today will be impossible to travel that kind of exhibition of high modernism, including Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, all these modernist artists. And it was the first important international modernist exhibition to be installed in a Venezuelan museum. So what happened? One of the factions related to El Techo de la Ballena and to the insurrection that was taking place in some cities of real guerrilla aligned with the Cuban Revolution, stole 5 pieces from that exhibition. They stole 5 pieces. But they stole the pieces to barter political prisoners for the artworks. So the insurrection, the thieves who belonged to this faction they were not aligned in the Communist Party in Venezuela. It's a very complicated story. The Communist Party in Venezuela was divided at the time. Some people believe that the revolution will occur in a guerrilla situation, and some others thought that it was going to happen differently. So this faction was a guerrilla faction, but was a division of the guerrilla faction, and they decided to steal the pieces in order to recover to ask for the release of political prisoners who were in jails. And these political prisoners were guerrilleros, they were guerrilla members. So when they asked the government, okay, we returned the art pieces, but you have to release the political prisoners, you can imagine that the government said, no, we're not going to do that. But Guy Debord, the prophet of situationism, read about this event. It was a major scandal in France. And he said that this was a model of political action. This was the real model that the avant-garde should take in the 60s. So to make the story short, it was like a situation of a comedy, because the works were stolen, but they were hidden in the house of some of the thieves, and then they called a writer in order to give the pieces to the writer, and the writer will help them releasing the political prisoners. But at the end, the writer was so furious that he called the police, and then they put the pieces in a truck, and the truck was abandoned in a bridge, and it's a very ridiculous situation. But in a way, they set the rules for more, let's say, oppositional situations to continue. When El Techo de la Ballena started to produce their books, they produced more than 40 books. The books, like in any of these, Rua Grupa, invited artists, collectives, the books were self-produced, and they were produced with the monies provided by the university. The Universidad Central de Venezuela, which was the integration of the art project from the 1950 to the 60s, in which they invited Hans Arp, Calder, Pepsner, and all these Fernand Léger, with Venezuelan artists to integrate the works into the architecture, was the target for the leftist to occupy, was the space that they occupy. To say the less, the left was only there in the 60s at the university. So when El Techo de la Ballena started to do these events like the homenaje a la cursilería, homage to schmaltz, homenaje a la necrophilia, the homage to necrophilia, etc., and to produce the self-produced books, they were financed by the university, the Central University of Venezuela, and produced there at the publishing house that the Universidad put together, which was an amazing publishing house. Having said all of this, in 1966, there was the fifth the 500th anniversary of the foundation of the city of Caracas. When all these things are happening at the same time, you know, all these insurrections, the university, the museum, the guerrillas, the urban guerrillas that were tactically, strategically advised by the Cuban government, by the Cuban Revolution. The 500th anniversary of Caracas is going to be celebrated, but there was a ¿cómo se dice terremoto? There was a terrible earthquake, a main earthquake that affected the city of Caracas. It was a major tragedy. People dead, many casualties. So they have to postpone the celebration. But what happened is that Miguel Arroyo, who was part of, again, Miguel Arroyo, who was part of the committee that was going to appoint the person or the curator who would make a special commission to celebrate el cuatricentenario de Caracas, sorry, the 400th anniversary of Caracas, appointed Jacobo Borges. Jacobo Borges was part of El Techo de la Ballena. Jacobo Borges was also a painter. And he was a painter who in 1966 decided to become a director of theater, but not any theater. Brecht was his model, Brechtian theater. So Jacobo Borges said, okay, I'm going to be the director of this project, and he won the commission. And he invited a bunch of people who were students at the Universidad Central de Venezuela to put together something called Imagen de Caracas. Imagen de Caracas was a re-evaluation of the 400 history of the nation, not slash nation state, the nation. And he decided to talk about the insurrections that were aborted or never took place. And he filmed insurrections and created a pavilion in order to present like an extended cinema in which these histories were reflected. They were made by a cooperative, by a workshop kind of model, very similar to this documenta. And of course, they were housed not in a conventional theater, but in a labyrinth kind of pavilion built by one of the architects who helped Villanueva to create the Universidad Central de Venezuela. So this is a very self-reflective kind of history that deals with the construction of a neo-avant-garde, that it's also in tandem, acting in tandem with the political situation of insurrection to the central government to create a new left, to create a new model for participation that was not the model ruled by the Communist Party, but a model that was reacting against the invasion to Czechoslovakia. We have to think about those terms, invasion of Czechoslovakia. I have to think about many other pogroms that was rejecting the model of the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. So I really wanted to talk about this very interesting moment of the Venezuelan cultural production that is very similar to what we see today in a biennial, and that created a model that was not acknowledged by the current political and social actors of Venezuela. And it's a model that has to be recovered in order to create participation and emancipation of the public. And that's what I wanted to say. If you wanna be part of this conversation, just ask me a question. I can talk to you about what happened. I'm sorry that I didn't bring any slide, but my book is coming very soon about this moment. And I think there are many other sources, political sources that are going to be discussed. For example, Teodoro Petkov, who created the Movimiento al Socialismo, that was part of the pacification. He was a guerrilla, a very brilliant guerrilla member. He decided that he will part waters with the Communist Party in 1968, and he wrote a book condemning the invasion to Czechoslovakia, for example. That was very brave for a communist in the 1968. So, and he also created a new breed of artists like Jacobo Borges and this generation who were working in new media, photography, film, etc., experimental film. So I think that has to be studied and has to be said, other than the template that we know about, high modernism in Venezuela. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. What happened to that school of thought after, like, I don't know, 20 years later or even now?
I think it was repressed. I think it was condemned to oblivion. It was erased, repressed, and not historicized. And that's what I want to do. I want to bring it back and to put it in the light of a revision of the left. Not about the insurrections of the 60s, but about a revision of a third way of a left. Everything that sounds leftist right now, as a result of Chavez, is suspicious for many people. And I think that these artists were doing a very interesting revision of history, like they were talking about insurrections of black people who were killed in the 19th century before Bolivar succeeded. We're talking about very progressive movements that were erased as well from history. So that's what happened with that history.
It's not really a question, just a response. So you were talking about you wanted to bring that, if I could phrase it as the ethos or spirits back to now. And I understand your position. You are actually a teacher in a university or art school. So how do you see that could happen? How could you embed that ethos of the history into now and here through your position?
Let me tell you that I did. It's a very good question. Thank you for the question. Long time ago, Deborah Collin was doing an exhibition at El Museo del Barrio called, I don't remember that, but it was a revision of the history of performance in Latin America. She asked me to take care of the Venezuelan part, as she asked many people to collaborate with her. And I said, you have to include Imagen de Caracas. Who knew about Imagen de Caracas? Nobody. Did you hear about it? No, nobody. So when I called Jacobo Borges, he said, I don't think that's relevant. And I said, it's very relevant. The same person who made Imagen de Caracas told me, I'm not sure. And I said, you have to put Imagen de Caracas there, because Imagen de Caracas is performative, expanded cinema, and also it's an institutional critique. So you have a layered event that was made to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the foundation of the city of Caracas in 1966, but it opened in 1968. It cost $1 million at the time, $1 million that the state of Venezuela provided. You created a whole generation of filmmakers. You made these unforgettable, gestures of recovering the history of insurrections in the 19th century. Do you think it's not important? And what happened is that it was included in that exhibition at the Museo del Barrio, and it was commented in the press. And since then on, I've been including Imagen de Caracas where I can. But Imagen de Caracas is one thing that happened. El Techo de la Ballena also made some other, gestures. And also the publications of El Techo de la Ballena have not been thought about it. And they're very important. For example, El Techo de la Ballena translated the beatnik poetry, but they also included in the course of their they produced a lot of opinions. They were opinion makers. They were producing a public opinion, sort of a public opinion, and they invited Ferlinghetti to be part of that kind of critique to the petro state in the 60s. There were people listening to them, you know, and there were people reacting to this. And I think there are artists who were, you know, using this kind of discourse in order to critique, you know, painting in the way that painting became like an academy of formalism. You know what I mean? So I think these things have been there, you know, like everywhere.
But do you think institutional critique could still have any impacts on today's situation? Or we should just establish another set of a system rather than constantly doing institutional critique again and again?
No, I agree with you. Institutional critique is a rhetoric as well. And it's very rusty at this point. It's exhausted. There is a fatigue there. We are all exhausted. But there is a way to reinvent criticality in the way that it's creative. I think this is a creative criticality. This space is activating this forum. I don't know if I'm very boring. Probably I'm boring because I'm very nervous and I'm jet lagged and I took a pill last night and probably I'm not the best person today. But I think it's important to activate spaces with this dialogue. This is a community. You created a community. And I think to create a community is very difficult nowadays. A community of people that are not insulting themselves and they're listening to each other.
Thank you. Thanks.
That's it, no? Thank you, INSTAR. Thank you.